what to do.
You know what you have to do, Martha.
The heat wasn't a comfort. It was a rhythmic assault that tasted of scorched lard and the metallic tang of old iron. Martha stood before the glowing maw of the brick oven, the sweat pooling in the hollow of her collarbone, turning the flour dust on her skin into a gray, cloying paste. Every breath was a desperate negotiation with the thick, yeast-heavy air that sat in her lungs like a wet stone. Her knees, strained from years of carrying the weight of her own body, throbbed with a dull, jagged heat that matched the orange pulse of the embers. The smell of baking bread, usually a promise of life, felt to her like a debt that could never be paid, a cycle of kneading and burning that left her hands cracked and her spirit hollowed. She moved toward the cooling rack, her footsteps producing a low, rhythmic groan from the floorboards that sounded like an accusation. To the people of Oakhaven, she was not Martha. She was a spectacle of excess in a hardscrabble land. She was the bakery barrel, a soft, trembling mass of meat and flour that occupied more space than she was worth. When she caught her reflection in the blackened window glass, she didn't see a young woman. She saw a mountain of shame, a body that felt like a prison of heavy, alkali-stained flesh. The silence in the bakery didn't just hang. It pressed against her ribs like a cold iron weight, suffocating the words before they could reach her lips. She was a burden to her father's ledger and a joke in the town's mouth, a creature of lard and silence waiting for a darkness to claim her. Then, the light in the doorway vanished. It didn't flicker, it was simply extinguished. A shadow, vast and jagged as a mountain ridge, spilled across the floured floor, stretching until it touched the hem of Martha's grease-stained apron. The temperature in the room plummeted, the heat of the oven suddenly losing its teeth to a draft that smelled of pine needles, wet stone, and the sharp, clean bite of high-altitude frost. Silas stood there, a giant carved from the very grit of the frontier. He didn't speak, but his presence was a thunderclap in the small shop, a silent promise of something ancient and unyielding. The laughter was a jagged thing, cutting through the humid air of the social hall like a rusted saw blade through green wood. Martha felt the weight of it, a physical pressure that made her lungs labor even harder. But then, the air changed. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall didn't just open. They were forced back by a gust of wind, so cold it felt like the breath of the mountain itself. The yellow tallow candles flickered and spat, several dying instantly, leaving the room in a bruised, flickering twilight. Silas stood in the threshold. He was a mountain of a man, draped in salt-cured elk hide and the scent of wood smoke and old snow. His presence was an absolute thing, a sudden density in the room that made the townspeople's mockery feel small and thin. He didn't move with the frantic energy of the townsmen. He moved with the slow, rhythmic inevitability of a rock slide. The crowd parted before him, not out of respect, but out of a primal hardscrabble fear that tightened throats like a hangman's knot. He walked straight toward the center of the floor, his boots, heavy mud-caked things, leaving dark imprints on the grit-strewn wood. He didn't look at the fiddle players who had frozen mid-note, nor did he look at the women who drew their skirts back as if his very shadow might stain them. His eyes, dark and unreadable as a frozen lake, were fixed on the space between Martha and the man who had just compared her to livestock. Abner Miller, usually a man of loud and bitter declarations, found his voice caught twixt his teeth. He tried to puff out his chest, but against the sheer scale of Silas, he looked like a withered cornstalk leaning against an iron oak. Silas stopped inches from Miller. The giant didn't growl. He didn't reach for the heavy knife at his belt. He simply stood there, his shadow swallowing Miller whole, his breathing a low, steady rumble that sounded like the earth shifting deep underground. The silence in the hall was no longer the silence of a verdict. It was the silence of a predator in the brush. Silas reached into the depths of his heavy coat. The movement was deliberate, tectonic. He pulled out a leather pouch, stained with the salt of a dozen winters and heavy with the weight of something that didn't belong in a town this poor. Thud. The sound of the pouch hitting the floorboards was the only note in the room. It was a dull, heavy sound that spoke of finality. A few gold coins, dull and ancient, ducats spilled from the mouth of the bag, catching the dying candlelight. Martha's father stared at the gold, his eyes widening with a greed that fought briefly with a flickering, rusted remnant of shame. Silas finally spoke. His voice didn't come from his throat. It seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves, a jagged, low vibration that made the glass in the windows hum. "I'm not buying a servant," Silas said, the words short and hard as flint. He turned his head slightly, looking at Martha's father, then back to Miller. "I'm settling a debt for a person who shouldn't have one." The statement was a blade, severing Martha's ties to the bakery, to the ledger, and to the cruel expectations of Oakhaven. Silas turned his gaze to Martha. He didn't look at her with the pity that had often felt like a slow-acting poison. And he looked at her as if she were a landmark, a solid and necessary part of the world. He reached out a hand, a massive, calloused hand that had broken stone and mended traps, and placed it gently on her shoulder. The touch wasn't heavy. It was a grounding force, a promise of stability in a world that had always felt like shifting sand. He didn't wait for a thank you. He didn't wait for her father to count the gold. He simply pointed his other hand toward the open door, toward the dark rising spine of the mountains where the alkali dust couldn't reach. Martha felt a strange lightness, a sensation that had nothing to do with the flesh on her bones and everything to do with the sudden absence of the town's suffocating grip. She looked at Miller, whose face was now a pale mask of humiliated silence, and then at her father, who was already reaching for the gold on the floor. The bitterness in her throat didn't vanish, but it crystallized into a steeled declaration. She stepped away from the wall. She stepped away from the shadows. With Silas at her side, a towering guardian of grit and mountain grace, she walked toward the door. Every footstep she took felt like a stone being laid for a new foundation. Behind them, the social hall remained frozen, the townspeople staring at the empty space where the bakery barrel had once been, now realizing that the silence she left behind was far heavier than her presence had ever been. They stepped out into the night, the cold air rushing into Martha's lungs like a drink of spring water, as they began the long, slow climb into the clouds. The ascent began in a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight, heavier than the gold Silas had left rotting on the floorboards of the social hall. They moved away from the flickering, judgmental lights of Oakhaven, trading the scent of sour cider for the sharp antiseptic bite of cedar and cooling stone. For Martha, every step was a battle against the geography of her own skin. The trail was a winding ribbon of shale and rooted earth, steep enough to make her calves scream with a jagged, white-hot heat. Her breath came in ragged, wet hitches, the mountain air thin and mocking as it whistled through her teeth. She waited for the jests. She waited for Silas to turn back, to see her struggling against the incline, and to regret the coin he had spent on a woman who moved with the grace of a collapsing cliffside. But the giant did not look back. He climbed with a slow, rhythmic inevitability, his broad back a wall of scarred leather that seemed to absorb the moonlight. He didn't offer a hand, nor did he offer a word of encouragement, and strangely, that was the first mercy Martha had ever known. He didn't treat her like a fragile glass doll, nor did he treat her like a broken beast. He simply expected her to follow. The silence twixt them wasn't the suffocating quiet of the bakery. It was the silence of the high timber, vast, indifferent, and clean. As the hours bled into the deep blue of the pre-dawn, the world changed. The alkali dust of the lowlands was replaced by a frost that sparkled like crushed diamonds on the pine needles. The wind, coming off the granite peaks, began to howl a low, mournful tune through the canyons, a sound like a hollowed bone being played by a ghost. Martha's dress was damp with sweat and mountain mist, the fabric clinging to her like a cold second skin. Her lungs felt as though they were lined with rusted iron, each inhalation a sharp metallic sting. Yet, with every agonizing mile, The image of Miller's mocking face and her father's downward gaze felt further away, drifting into the shadows of the valley like smoke from a dying fire. They reached the cabin as the first gray light of morning began to bleed over the eastern ridge. It sat in a high, lonely bowl of rock and stunted timber, a structure of unpeeled logs that looked as though it had grown directly out of the mountain's ribs. It was a hard-scrabble place, weathered by decades of brutal winters until the wood was the color of a sun-bleached skull. The roof sagged under a coat of ancient moss, and the single window was a dark, sightless eye. Silas stopped at the heavy timber door. He didn't enter immediately. He turned to Martha, his face a landscape of shadows and deep-set lines. In the pale light, the scars on his neck, thick silver ridges that disappeared into his collar, looked like a map of a war he had never quite left. He didn't speak a stuttered greeting. He simply stepped aside, gesturing for her to cross the threshold first. The interior of the cabin was a shock that hit Martha harder than the cold. It didn't smell of home. It smelled of neglect and the slow, rhythmic rot of a place where a soul had merely existed, not lived. The air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of stale grease, wood smoke, and the musky, pungent odor of untreated pelts. A layer of gray ash had spilled from the hearth, coating the floorboards like a shroud. In the corner, a bed of pine boughs and matted blankets looked more like a predator's den than a man's resting place. There were no chairs, only a single three-legged stool and a table hacked from a fallen oak, its surface scarred by 1,000 knife cuts. Martha stood in the center of the room, her presence filling the small space. She looked at the rusted cast-iron stove, its belly cold and choked with soot. She looked at the shelves, which held nothing but a few dented tins and a sack of flour that had been chewed by mice. The isolation wasn't just in the distance from town, it was in the hollowed-out spirit of the house itself. Silas moved past her to the hearth. He knelt, his massive frame dwarfing the fireplace, and began to strike flint against steel. The sound, scritch, 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 was the only heartbeat the house had. He didn't look at her as he coaxed a small orange flicker from a nest of dry moss. He didn't tell her where to sleep or what her duties were. He simply tended the fire, his movements slow and deliberate, his breathing the only clock in the timeless chill of the peaks. Martha felt a sudden sharp prickle of friction in her spirit. This was the mountain giant's lair, a place of iron and bone, and she was a creature of yeast and soft dough. She looked at her hands, still white with the ghosts of the bakery's flour, and then at the filth of the cabin. A cold weight pressed against her ribs. She realized then that Silas hadn't brought her here to be a wife in any way the town understood. But he had brought her here because he was drowning in his own silence, and he had reached for the only other soul that looked as weathered as he felt. The fire in the hearth didn't roar. It hissed a low, resentful tune, feeding on damp cedar that spat embers like angry thoughts. As the light flickered, the shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed to stretch and lean toward the center of the room, skeletal fingers of darkness claiming the space that the weak flame couldn't hold. Martha stood by the heavy oak table, her fingers tracing a deep, jagged gouge in the wood. In the town, there had always been the hum of gossip, the clatter of pans, and the rhythmic thud of the flour mill. Here, the silence was a living thing. It had a weight to it, a pressure that made the inner mechanics of her own ears pulse with the sound of her blood. Silas didn't offer a bed. He didn't offer a blanket. He moved to the corner and pulled a heavy, moth-eaten wool coat over his shoulders, settling onto the floorboards by the fire with his back against the logs. He closed his eyes, his breathing slowing until it was nothing more than a deep, tectonic vibration. He was a man who had made a pact with the cold, and he expected the world to do the same. Martha looked at the window. The frost was already beginning to bloom across the glass, crystalline patterns that looked like the skeletal fingers of the past trying to claw their way back in. She felt the worn, thin edges of her courage fraying. Back in Oakhaven, she had been a joke, but she'd been a joke with a bed. Here, she was a person of substance in a world that offered only iron and ice. She found a pile of discarded, amongst stiffened pelts in the corner, deer hides that had been cured poorly and left to rot. The smell was a sharp alkaline bite that stung her nostrils, but the cold was sharper. She dragged the hides toward the far wall, the sound of the dry skin scraping against the floorboards echoing like a scream in the stillness. She lay down, the hard timber pressing against her hip, the corset still a rusted cage around her ribs. She didn't unlace it, she didn't dare. She lay there, staring at the ceiling where the soot hung in heavy oily cobwebs, and wondered if the silence of the mountain was simply a different kind of grave than the bakery. Internal echoes of her father's voice rattled in her skull. "You're a liability, girl, a frame that no horse can carry." She closed her eyes, and for a moment, the smell of the rotting hides transformed into the memory of scorched lard. She realized then that Silas hadn't spoken a single word to her since they left the social hall. His silence wasn't a punishment, it was a void. He had provided the gold, and he had provided the shelter, but the worth of her life was a debt she would have to settle with herself. The friction twixt her old life and this new, hardscrabble reality was a jagged edge that cut deep. Every time she shifted on the hard floor, the pelts crackled, a reminder of the neglect that permeated this house. This wasn't a home. It was a carcass of a life. And as the first night on the mountain deepened, Martha didn't cry. She reached out and touched the cold, grease-stained leg of the table. Her fingers gripped the wood until her knuckles turned white. Well, and if this man was a mountain of stone, she would have to be the fire that cracked it. If this cabin was a tomb of neglect, she would have to be the one to exhume the living. She wouldn't be a barrel to be stored. She would be the hand that held the salt and the light. The dawn didn't break over the mountain. It bled through the single soot-stained window in shades of bruised lavender and slate. Martha woke to a cold that felt like a physical intrusion, a thin, sharp blade of air that had found the gaps in her makeshift bed of rotting pelts and settled deep in her marrow. The corset was a rusted ring of iron around her ribs, a reminder of the town she had left behind, its whalebone stays pressing against her skin until it felt like she was being slowly bifurcated. She stood, her joints popping with the sound of dry kindling, and looked at the silence. Silas was gone. The heavy door was latched, but the giant's presence remained in the lingering scent of wood smoke and the absence of his heavy, rhythmic breathing. She looked at the frost on the glass. It didn't just obscure the view. It had grown into intricate skeletal forests, white-veined and crystalline. They looked like the fingers of the high-altitude winter reaching in to reclaim the cabin, a map of the desolation that had ruled this place long before she arrived. Each frond of frost was a testament to the neglect of the hearth. Back in Oak Haven, the bakery window was always steamed, a fog of yeast and warmth that spoke of life. Here, the glass was a frozen barrier, a portrait of a house that had forgotten how to breathe. Martha reached out and touched the glass with a calloused thumb. The cold bit into her flesh, a sharp alkaline sting that made her pull back, leaving a small dark smudge in the center of the white forest. She turned her gaze to the table, the scarred, greasy heart of the room. It wasn't just dirty, it was defeated. Layers of old fat, spilled ale, and the grit of 1,000 mountain days had formed a gray, waxy skin over the oak. Martha's internal echo, the voice of her mother that had been drowned out by the town's mockery for years, whispered a steel declaration: "A house without a clean table is a house that's given up on tomorrow." She didn't have a broom, she didn't have soap. She had only the weight of her body and the steeled grit of a woman who had spent a lifetime being told she was too much. She found a rusted iron bucket near the door. The handle was cold enough to stick to her skin, but she gripped it anyway, stepping out into the biting air to find the spring. The path was a jagged incline of frozen mud and shale. Every step was a labor, her lungs burning with the thin, metallic air of the peaks. When she found the water, it was a trickle of liquid ice emerging from a cleft in the granite. She knelt, her heavy skirts soaking up the moisture, and filled the bucket. The weight of the water was immense, pulling at her shoulders until the muscles, twixt her blades, felt like they were being torn by dull hooks. But she didn't stop. She carried the water back to the cabin, her breath coming in white, rhythmic plumes that vanished into the trees. Inside, she began the great cleaning. She didn't start with a prayer. She started with a handful of fine, baked gray sand she had gathered from the stream bed and a scrap of coarse wool from a discarded tunic. She knelt by the table and began to scrub. The sound was a low, rhythmic rasp, scritch, 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 that filled the hollowed-out silence of the room. Her arms, thick and powerful from years of kneading 50-pound mounds of dough, moved with a relentless tectonic force. She didn't just wipe the surface, she attacked it. The gray wax of the grease resisted at first, a stubborn skin of neglect, but Martha pressed harder. The sweat began to bead on her forehead, mixing with the flour dust still trapped in her hair, turning into a gray paste that dripped onto the wood. Her back screamed, a jagged, white-hot heat that radiated from her spine. But she didn't yield. She thought of Miller's mocking laugh. Every rotation of her hand was a blow against his face. She thought of her father's silence. Every inch of oak she reclaimed was a word he had never dared to speak in her defense. After an hour, the first hint of grain appeared, a deep, rich, honey-colored oak hidden beneath the rot. Martha didn't smile, but her heart thudded with a slow, steady pulse of victory. She moved to the hearth. She used a flat stone to scrape the years of built-up soot from the stones, the black dust filling her throat until she tasted the bitterness of ancient fires. She hauled the ash out by the bucketful, dumping it into the snow until the fireplace was a clean gray maw, ready for a new life. Then came the recipe. Martha found the sack of flour. It was a hardscrabble heap of grain, infested with weevils and clumped with damp. Most would have burned it. Martha sat on the three-legged stool and began to sift. She used a piece of fine mesh wire she found in the tool shed, her fingers moving with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. She separated the life from the rot, grain by grain. She mixed the flour with the spring water and a pinch of salt she found at the bottom of a rusted tin. There was no yeast, so she used a bit of fermented mash she found in a jar, hoping the mountain air held enough wildlife to make it rise. The kneading was the only prayer she knew. She pushed the heel of her hand into the dough, folding, turning, and pushing again. The dough was stiff and resistant, much like the mountain itself, but Martha was relentless. She worked it until her arms ached with a dull, throbbing heat, until the dough was smooth and elastic, a living thing born of her own labor. She set the bowl near the small fire she had rebuilt, watching it as if it were a sleeping child. The aroma began to change. The cabin no longer smelled only of wet fur and stale grease. It began to hold the faint, sweet promise of fermenting grain. It was a small change, a mere flicker of life in a wilderness of ice, but to Martha it was a declaration. She wasn't a barrel being stored. She was the architect of this room's survival. She looked at her hands, red, raw from the lye and the scrubbing, and dusted once again in the white ghost of her trade. They were the hands of the salt of the earth, and for the first time in 30 years, the silence in the room didn't press against her ribs. It waited. The aroma of the bread began to dominate the cabin, a warm, golden scent that fought against the lingering smell of wet fur and ancient dust. It was the smell of a promise, one that Martha hadn't heard in years. As the dough rose by the hearth, she didn't sit. The worn, thin exhaustion in her limbs was a familiar weight, but it was no longer a burden of shame. It was the fatigue of a builder. She turned her attention to the rest of the cabin's neglect. In the shadows of the corners lay a chaotic hoarding of years, rusted traps, broken harnesses, and a mountain of tangled, unwashed wool that looked like the discarded coats of ghosts. Martha knelt before the pile, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been the invisible engine of a household for a decade. She didn't just move things, she categorized them. The metal was separated from the wood, the salvageable from the rot. She found a tin of old lard, its surface gray and cracked like alkali soil. She placed it near the fire until it melted into a clear amber liquid. With a scrap of linen, she began to oil the rusted iron. The sound of the cloth against the metal, shh, 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 was a rhythmic meditation. She wiped away the orange corrosion from the knives, the hinges, and the heavy iron skillet until they began to gleam with a dark, defiant luster. Each stroke was a steel declaration. This house would no longer be a graveyard for useful things. Next, she took the stiffened, matted pelts that had been her bed the night before. She dragged them outside into the biting mountain air. The wind whipped her skirts and stung her eyes, but she didn't retreat. She draped the hides over a fallen log and began to beat them with a heavy cedar branch. The dust flew in great gray clouds, vanishing into the pine-scented wind. She beat them until her shoulders burned with a jagged, white-hot heat, until the matted fur began to loosen and breathe again. Inside, she found a small, neglected stash of coffee beans, old and dry, but still holding the ghost of a rich, dark scent. She didn't have a grinder, so she placed the beans between two flat stones. The sound of the beans being crushed twixt the granite was a low, satisfying crunch. She boiled the spring water, the steam rising to meet the soot-stained rafters, and added the grounds. The smell of the coffee, sharp and bitter and grounding, mixed with the sweet, yeasty perfume of the baking bread. For the first time, the cabin felt like it had a heartbeat. The bread was ready. She pulled the loaf from the oven, its crust a deep, crackling mahogany. It didn't look like the delicate pastries of the Oakhaven socials. It looked like a stone pulled from the earth, solid and vital. As the loaf cooled, she used the last of the lard to fry a few strips of salt pork she had found in a brine jar. The fat popped and sizzled in the newly cleaned skillet, the sound a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence of the previous night. Just as the sun began to dip behind the jagged granite peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow, the heavy door groaned on its hinges. Silas stood in the threshold. He was a silhouette of salt-cured leather and cold mountain air, his broad shoulders flecked with frost. He stopped. His boots, frozen to the wood, didn't move. Yet he didn't speak. He never spoke, but his chest expanded in a long, slow inhalation. He didn't smell the rot. He didn't smell the stale grease of a decade's neglect. He smelled the bread. He smelled the coffee. He smelled the clean, honest scent of a house that had been resurrected. His gaze traveled over the room. He saw the table, its grain glowing like honey in the firelight. He saw the tools, organized and gleaming. He saw the pelts, no longer a pile of refuse, but folded neatly by the hearth. The shock on his face wasn't a flicker. It was a tectonic shift. His eyes, usually as unreadable as a frozen lake, softened into something that looked dangerously like wonder. Martha stood by the stove, her hands tucked into her apron, her face flushed from the heat of the fire. She didn't offer a stuttered greeting. She didn't apologize for her presence or the space she occupied. She simply picked up a knife, the heavy, sharp one she had cleaned, and sliced into the warm bread. The sound of the crust breaking was like a bone snapping in the silence. She placed a thick slab of bread and a portion of the salt pork onto a wooden trencher and set it on the clean table. She didn't look at him directly. She looked at the steam rising from the coffee. "It's time to eat," she said. The words were short, jagged, and steeled. They weren't an invitation, they were a fact. Silas moved then. He walked to the table, his massive frame making the floorboards whine, and sat on the stool she had scrubbed. He picked up the bread with hands that were stained with the grit of the mountain, and as he took the first bite, the silence in the room changed. Yet it was no longer the silence of two strangers trapped in a tomb. It was the rhythmic, grounding silence of two souls sharing the salt of the earth. Martha watched him from the shadows of the stove, the internal echoes of the town's laughter finally growing faint. She wasn't a barrel here. She was the one who had brought the light, and as Silas looked up from his meal, his dark eyes meeting hers for a fleeting, silent second, she realized that the giant wasn't just a protector. He was a man who had been starving for a home, and she was the only one who knew the recipe for one. The wind didn't just blow that evening, it developed teeth. It gnawed at the corners of the cabin, a low, rhythmic howling that sounded like a choir of hollowed souls wandering the granite peaks. Outside, the world was being erased by a whiteout of sleet and alkali-pale snow, but inside, the air was held captive by the warmth of the hearth and the grounding scent of cedar smoke. Martha sat by the fire, her heavy frame settled into a chair Silas had spent the afternoon reinforcing with notched pine and iron nails. In her hands was the giant's wool coat, a garment so worn thin in the elbows and shoulders that it looked more like a map of his hardships than a piece of clothing. She moved the needle with a steeled precision, the silver point biting through the thick salt-cured wool with a rhythmic snip-slide. Snip-slide. Silas sat across from her, his massive hands resting on his knees. He wasn't looking at the fire. He was watching the way Martha's fingers worked. In the flickering orange light, the scars on his face, jagged, the silver lines that traced the history of 1,000 hardscrabble days, seemed to soften. The silence twixt them was no longer a wall, it was a bridge. It was the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled with the hollowed-out chatter of the town. "The storm's got a bitter edge tonight," Martha said, her voice low and grounded, the words cutting through the whistle of the wind. She didn't look up from her mending. She knew the weight of his gaze. "I reckon the pass will be choked by midnight." Silas didn't answer immediately. He leaned forward, the firelight catching the deep rusted shadows of his eyes. He reached out, his hand hovering over a particularly deep scar on the table before he pulled it back, as if unsure of how to occupy a space that felt like a home. "Let it choke," he finally said. The words were short, jagged sentences, but his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Martha's chest. "Better the snow than the tongues in Oakhaven." Martha paused, the needle held mid-air. She looked at him then, really looked at him, past the scars and the selective mutism. She saw a man who had been hollowed out by the world long before he ever climbed this mountain. "They called me a barrel, Silas," she said, her voice steady, though the memory felt like a cold iron weight against her ribs. "A thing to be stored or traded for a gambler's debt. My father, he looked at me and saw only the flour I used and the space I took." She went back to the coat, her stitches growing tighter, more forceful. "I spent 30 years trying to be small enough to disappear twixt the cracks in the floorboards. But the mountain, it don't care about small. It only cares about what's solid." Silas shifted, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. He reached into the collar of his shirt and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket, the metal rusted at the hinges. He didn't open it. He simply held it in his palm, a piece of a past that stayed buried beneath his silence. "I had a sister," he whispered, the words sounding like they were being dragged over broken glass. "Small, like a bird. The fever took her in a winter like this. My father, he said she was too weak for the frontier. Said the salt of the earth was only for those who could carry the weight." He looked at Martha, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of softness in the granite of his expression. "You aren't a barrel, Martha. You're the foundation. The town, they're just the dust that blows off the ridge." The internal echo of his words felt like a warm draft against the bitterness of her memories. Martha felt a strange, shimmering heat in her chest that had nothing to do with the hearth. She reached across the small gap between them and placed her hand, wide, calloused, and strong, over his. His skin was like bark, rough and weathered, but beneath it, she could feel the steady tectonic pulse of his heart. He didn't pull away. He turned his hand over, lacing his massive fingers through hers. The contrast was stark. His scarred, mountain-hewn strength joined with her flower-dusted, resilient power. In that moment, the cabin felt like the only solid place in a world of shifting snow and alkali lies. "I reckon we both got debts the world tried to collect," Martha said. A steel declaration. "But we're squared up now, Silas, we're squared up." The wind shrieked against the logs, a desperate, hungry sound, but the silence inside was full. It was the silence of two souls who had finally found a geography where they weren't too much or too little. They were simply enough. The blizzard didn't just arrive. It made an entry like a mourning widow seeking blood. The wind became a screaming thing, 1,000 rusted saws cutting through the gaps in the logs, bringing with it a fine, alkali pale powder that hissed against the floorboards. The temperature in the cabin plummeted, the warmth of the hearth stripped away by the sheer tectonic force of the mountain's rage. A sudden violent crack echoed through the room. The single window, brittle from the cold, had surrendered to the pressure of the wind. Shards of glass sprayed across the floor like frozen tears, and the night rushed in, a freezing, lightless tide. Silas was on his feet before the glass hit the wood. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He moved with the slow, rhythmic efficiency of a man who had spent a lifetime bargaining with death. He grabbed a heavy plank of cedar and a handful of forged nails, but the wind was a physical wall, pushing back against the timber with the strength of a stampede. "Hold it!" Silas's voice was a jagged rasp, barely audible over the shriek of the storm. Martha didn't hesitate. She stepped into the breach, her heavy frame a solid anchor against the gale. She placed her shoulder against the cedar plank, her feet finding purchase on the grit-strewn floor. For the first time, her weight, the very thing Oakhaven had used to hollow out her soul, was the only thing standing between them and the killing frost. She felt the raw power of the storm pressing against her, a cold iron weight that tried to buckle her knees, but she held. She was a woman of the salt of the earth, and she would not be moved. Silas hammered the nails with a rhythmic steeled force. The vibration of each strike traveled through the wood and into Martha's bones, a pulse of shared labor that made the internal echoes of the town's mockery feel like distant, dying embers. In the cramped, freezing space by the window, their bodies pressed together, her softness meeting his scarred, leathered hardness. There was no shame in the contact, only the desperate, grounding grit of survival. When the last nail was driven home, the sudden absence of the wind's roar was deafening. The cabin was dark, lit only by the dying orange eye of the hearth. They stood there for a moment, their breath coming in white, synchronized plumes that vanished into the rafters. Silas didn't pull away immediately. He looked at Martha, his dark eyes tracing the line of her jaw, seeing not a barrel, but a fortress. He turned then, moving toward the shadows beneath the heavy oak table. He knelt and pried up a loose floorboard, a secret cache hidden from the rot and the mice. He reached inside and pulled out a small canvas-wrapped bundle. He didn't hand it to her. He placed it on the table with a reverence that made Martha's heart thud against her ribs. "For the baker," he whispered. Martha's fingers trembled as she unwrapped the canvas. And inside were things that shouldn't have existed in this high, hardscrabble wilderness. A small tin of real Ceylon cinnamon, a jar of dark, viscous molasses, a heavy hand-carved rolling pin made of polished bird's-eye maple. The scent of the cinnamon hit her, a warm, spicy ghost of a memory that made the cold in the room feel less like a threat. Silas had been gathering these things, trip by trip, year by year, before he ever even walked into that social hall. He hadn't just bought her, he had been preparing a place for her soul to breathe. "You knew," Martha said, her voice a steel declaration that broke twixt a sob and a laugh. "You knew who I was." Silas didn't look away. He stood tall, his head nearly brushing the soot-stained beams. "I knew you were the one who could make the mountain taste like something more than just bitterness and alkali." Martha picked up the rolling pin. It felt right in her hand, solid, balanced, and vital. The internal monologue that usually whispered of her worthlessness fell silent. She looked at the cinnamon, the color of the very earth they lived upon, and realized that her worth wasn't a debt to be settled with gold. It was a legacy to be baked into every loaf and every stitch. She reached out and touched Silas's arm, her thumb tracing the edge of a scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow. It was a jagged, worn, thin mark, but under her touch, it felt like a map of the home they were building. The storm outside continued to howl, a desperate, hungry beast, but inside, the silence was full. Oh, they were no longer two strangers trapped by a winter. They were a foundation. As they sat back down by the fire, the aroma of the cinnamon began to mingle with the wood smoke, a sweet, defiant scent that told the mountain that life had taken root. Martha leaned her head against the high back of her chair, her eyes closing as the warmth finally began to win. She wasn't small, and she wasn't light, but for the first time in her life, she felt as though she were floating, carried by the strength of a man who saw the beauty in the heavy, honest salt of her soul. The spring thaw in the high country was not a celebration of life. It was a messy, jagged unveiling of everything the winter had failed to kill. The snow, once a pristine shroud that had granted Martha a temporary amnesia, began to recede with a slow, agonizing groan. As it vanished, it left behind a landscape of alkali pale mud and the skeletal gray remains of trees that hadn't survived the season's teeth. The air, though losing its sub-zero bite, carried a new kind of heaviness, the scent of rotting pine needles, the cold, metallic dampness of granite sweating under the sun, and the pungent, fermented smell of earth that had been suffocated for months. It was a worn, thin season, where the world felt raw and exposed like a fresh wound that hadn't yet begun to scab. But every step Martha took outside the cabin was a negotiation with the muck, the mud pulling at her boots with a rhythmic, wet suction that sounded like the earth trying to reclaim her. Martha stood outside the cabin, her hands buried in a massive wooden tub of gray, lie-heavy water. She was scrubbing the winter's soot from their heavy wool bedding, her movements a rhythmic tectonic pulse of labor. The corset was a ghost of the past now. She wore a loose-fitting tunic of indigo-dyed wool she had fashioned herself, the fabric allowing her lungs to expand to their full, honest capacity. Her body, though still of substantial geography, moved with a newfound fluidity. The bakery barrel had been forged into something tempered, a woman of the salt of the earth whose strength was no longer a joke whispered in Oakhaven, but the very foundation of this high mountain home. She felt the heat in her shoulders, a dull, thrumming ache that she welcomed. It was a clean pain. But then, the sound reached her. It wasn't the natural music of the mountain, not the cry of a hawk or the snap of a thawing branch. It was the rhythmic, hollowed-out thud of unshod hooves against the softening earth and the metallic jingle of harness brass. It was a sound that belonged to the lowlands, to the dust-choked streets where debts were tallied and spirits were sold. Martha's heart didn't flutter. It dropped into her stomach like a cold stone. The internal echo of her father's voice, a ghost she thought she had buried under layers of cinnamon and cedar smoke, suddenly screamed in the back of her mind. "You're a liability, girl, a frame that no horse can carry." The soapy water felt suddenly freezing against her skin. She looked toward the ridge trail, where the shadows of the pines stretched like long, accusatory fingers across the mud. 4 riders emerged from the timber. In the lead was Abner Miller. He sat atop a bay gelding that looked as ill-tempered and salt-cured as its master. Miller was dressed in a coat of fine, dark broadcloth that looked absurdly fragile against the rugged grit of the peaks. He wore the expression of a man who had been cheated and had spent every waking hour since the social hall sharpening his resentment like a skinning knife. Beside him rode Martha's father. He looked smaller than she remembered, his shoulders hunched in a permanent flinch, his eyes darting toward the cabin with a mixture of desperate greed and a flickering, rusted remnant of shame. Behind them were the shadows, 2 men Martha didn't recognize. They had the hollowed-out eyes of men who had seen too much war and the heavy, grease-stained belts of hired muscle. Their horses were lean, mountain-bred beasts, and across their saddles rested Winchester rifles, the barrels gleaming with a cold, predatory light that signaled the end of the mountain's peace. The silence that followed their arrival was absolute. It wasn't the grounding silence Martha and Silas shared. It was the suffocating silence of a courtroom before a hanging. Silas emerged from the tool shed. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He moved with the slow, rhythmic inevitability of a rock slide, his boots crushing the thawing ice as he stepped into the center of the clearing. He carried a heavy felling axe, its head polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the bruised slate gray of the sky. He stood between the riders and Martha, his massive frame creating a wall of scarred leather and mountain grit. Miller pulled his horse to a halt, the animal's hooves churning the mud into a dark, viscous soup. He didn't look at Silas. He looked at Martha, his lip curling in a display of performative disgust. He scanned her new form, the way she stood tall, the way the indigo wool draped over her shoulders. To him, she wasn't a woman who had found her soul. She was a piece of inventory that had been polished without his permission. "Well, look at this," Miller said, his voice a jagged rasp that carried the scent of Oakhaven's bitterness. "The barrel's gone and found herself a mountaintop. I reckon the air up here agrees with you, Martha. You look almost solid. Though I imagine you've eaten this poor fool out of a year's worth of supplies already. That's the trouble with meat like yours. It requires constant feeding." Martha didn't speak. She felt the hot sting of the lie on her hands, but her gaze was fixed on Miller's eyes. She thought of the recipe detail, how she had learned to sift the rot from the grain. She saw the rot in Miller now, clearer than she ever had in the bakery. "What do you want, Abner?" Her voice was grounded, the words short and hard as flint. Her father spoke then, his voice a weak, fluttering thing that made Martha's stomach turn. "Now, Martha, don't be that way. There's been, complications. That gold Silas left? It was old coin, girl, foreign and strange. The bank in town, they wouldn't take it at full value. They say the debt on the bakery was deeper than the ledger showed. And Miller here, he's got a paper, a legal standing that says the transaction was faulty." Miller reached into the breast of his broadcloth coat and pulled out a sheet of parchment. It was a heavy, expensive-looking paper, the edges curled and yellowed like an old bone. He held it up, the ink of the judge's signature looking like a dark, jagged scar across the white surface. "This is a writ of reclamation," Miller hissed, his eyes narrowing, "signed by the circuit judge in the valley. It says the sale at the social hall was an informal transaction, not a binding contract. Since the debt to your father hasn't been fully satisfied in the eyes of the law, and since you're still legally a dependent of the bakery's estate, I'm here to collect my property. I didn't come for the gold, Silas. I came for the labor I was promised." The word property hit the air like a spray of alkali dust, dry and suffocating. Silas's grip on the axe handle tightened until the wood groaned in protest. He didn't look at the paper. He looked at the pulse jumping in Miller's neck. "She isn't property," Silas said, the words rising from his chest like a low tectonic vibration that seemed to make the very mud beneath them tremble. "And the debt was settled in gold that's been in my family since before Oakhaven was a scar on the map. You got what you wanted. Now turn those horses around before the mountain decides it don't want you here." The two hired men shifted in their saddles, the leather creaking like a warning. They didn't care about the law or the debt. They cared about the weight of the rifles in their hands. The one on the left, a man with a jagged scar across his nose, spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the snow. It looked like a bloodstain on the white shroud of the mountain. "I'm not here to argue with a mute giant who thinks a few gold coins can buy a woman's soul," Miller shouted, his face reddening with the heat of his own arrogance. "I've got the law behind me, and I've got men who know how to handle uncooperative elements. You can keep your mountain, Silas. But I'm taking the girl. There's work to be done in the valley, floors to be scrubbed, wood to be hauled, and I'm tired of doing it myself. She's coming back to Oakhaven to serve out her father's debt in my house, the way it was intended from the start." Martha looked at her father. He still wouldn't meet her eyes. He was staring at the pommel of his saddle, his fingers twitching. He was a man who had sold his daughter once for a gambler's marker, and he was doing it again for a sense of security he would never find. The bitterness in Martha's throat was sharp, but it was mixed with a new metallic tang of fury. These men saw her as a ledger entry, a bakery barrel, to be rolled from one cellar to another, a thing to be used until she was worn thin and discarded. "I'm not going back," Martha said, her voice rising over the whistle of the wind that was beginning to pick up speed through the canyons. "That life is buried under the snow. I belong to this mountain, I belong to this house, and I don't owe you a single breath of my life, Abner Miller." "You belong where the law says you belong," Miller screamed, gesturing wildly to the hired thugs. Take her. If the giant moves, put a hole in him. I reckon the mountain won't miss one more ghost, and a man like him is better off buried in the rock anyway." The internal monologue in Martha's mind was no longer a retreat into shame. It was a call to arms. She looked at the scarred, leathered back of Silas, the man who had seen the worth in her when she was hollowed out by the world. She saw the way his muscles pulled under his tunic, a map of a war he was willing to fight for her. As the hired men began to dismount, their boots splashing into the mud with a heavy, ominous thud, the first clouds of a late-season storm began to roll over the granite peaks. The light turned a bruised slate gray, and the wind picked up, carrying the scent of ice and a coming calamity. The past had returned to reclaim its mistake, but it had forgotten one thing. A woman of the frontier, once she finds her footing on the salt of the earth, is harder to move than the mountain itself. She wouldn't be taken. She wouldn't be rolled away. She would stand, even if the world crumbled around her. The sky above the granite peaks did not simply darken. It underwent a violent, bruised transformation, turning the color of a week-old contusion. The air, which only moments ago had carried the wet promise of spring, suddenly sharpened into a jagged, crystalline edge. A low, rhythmic vibration began to hum through the soles of Martha's boots, not the thud of hooves, but the tectonic groan of the mountain itself. The worn, thin piece of the clearing was about to be devoured by a calamity that cared nothing for legal papers or gamblers' debts. The first gust of the storm didn't blow. It struck like a physical hand, carrying a spray of alkali pale sleet that hissed against the logs of the cabin. The hired men, who had been advancing with the predatory grace of wolves, staggered as the wind tried to strip the breath from their lungs. Miller, clutching his precious writ of reclamation, found himself nearly unseated as his bay gelding reared in a blind primal terror. The animal knew what the men were too arrogant to realize. The mountain was reclaiming its silence. "Get her!" Miller screamed, his voice a thin, ragged screech that was instantly swallowed by the rising roar of the wind. Silas moved then, his felling axe a silver blur in the twilight. Yet he didn't wait for the thugs to recover. He stepped into the muck, his massive frame a solid anchor against the gale. He met the first man, the one with the scarred nose, just as the man leveled his Winchester. Silas didn't use the blade. He used the flat of the axe head, a heavy rhythmic blow that sent the man sprawling into the freezing mud. But before he could turn to the second, the mountain decided the debt was due. A sound like 1,000 freight trains derailed echoed from the ridge above. It was a wet, visceral thud that shook the very foundation of the earth. The spring thaw, combined with the sudden violent weight of the late-season sleet, had turned the upper slope into a viscous, tectonic tongue of rock and mud. It came down the ravine with the speed of a stampede, a slurry of uprooted pines and granite boulders that looked like the skeletal fingers of the earth reaching down to erase the clearing. "Silas!" Martha's voice was a steel declaration, a scream that tore through the freezing air. She saw it happen in a series of jagged staccato flashes. Silas, sensing the slide, lunged not for safety but toward Martha, intending to shield her with the sheer geography of his body. As he moved, a massive ancient cedar, its roots undermined by the melting snow, groaned and succumbed to the slide. The timber fell with a sickening, heavy thump, its weight amplified by the rushing mud. Silas didn't have time to evade. The trunk struck him across the thighs, pinning him into the freezing, alkali-stained muck just as the edge of the mudslide reached the cabin's perimeter. He didn't cry out. He didn't beg. He simply let out a low, guttural grunt as his lungs were compressed by the cold iron weight of the tree and the earth. Then, for a heartbeat, there was a terrible, suffocating silence, the silence of the grave. The main force of the slide had bypassed the cabin, diverted by a natural outcropping of rock, but the damage was done. The clearing was a graveyard of gray mud and shattered timber. Miller and his men had been thrown back toward the tree line. Their horses vanished into the timber, leaving them dazed and battered in the rising blizzard. Martha was the first to move. She didn't feel the cold biting into her skin. She felt only the fire of a singular, heroic purpose. She scrambled across the shifting mud, her heavy skirts dragging in the filth, until she reached Silas. He was half buried, his face as pale as the alkali dust of the valley, his breathing a shallow, wet rattle. The massive cedar trunk sat across him like a tombstone. "Silas," she whispered, her hands, those strong, flower-dusted hands, gripping the rough bark of the tree. His eyes opened, dark and unreadable as a frozen lake. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something twixt agony and a plea. He tried to move, but the mountain held him fast. He was the giant, the protector, and he was incapacitated, a prisoner of the very grit he had called home. From the edge of the clearing, a laugh, dry and cruel as wind through dead cornstalks, broke the silence. Abner Miller had pulled himself from the mud. His fine broadcloth coat was ruined, a tattered rag of vanity, and his face was smeared with gray grit. He held his rifle, the barrel shaking slightly, but his eyes were alight with a predatory opportunism. His hired men were rising too, clutching their bruised limbs, their faces hardening into masks of malice. "Well now," Miller spat, a dark stream of blood and mud hitting the snow. "Look at the Mountain King now, pinned like a moth to a board. I reckon the law didn't need to do much. The earth did it for us." He stepped closer, the mud sucking at his boots. He looked at Martha, who was still kneeling by Silas's head. To him she was still the bakery barrel, a soft thing that would break under the first sign of pressure. "Step away from him, Martha," Miller commanded, his voice regaining its jagged arrogance. "He's a dead man. If the tree don't kill him, the frost will. You're coming with us. I've lost my horse and my dignity today. Yeah, and I'm taking my payment in the flesh I was promised. You'll serve me in Oakhaven until you're worn thin, and then I'll discard you like the waste you are." Martha felt a change. It wasn't a slow transition. It was a heroic shift that recalibrated her soul. She looked at the men, then at the rifle lying just out of Silas's reach, half submerged in the muck. The internal monologue that had haunted her for 30 years, the voices of her father, the town, and her own shame, went silent. They were replaced by the shadow rule of the frontier. When the world tries to hollow you out, you become the iron that fills the void. She didn't plead. She didn't cry. She stood up. She stood up with the rhythmic, slow power of a rising tide. The indigo wool of her tunic was stained with the salt of the earth, and her hair, once neatly braided, was a wild thicket around her face. She looked larger than she ever had in Oakhaven, not because of her girth, but because of the space her spirit now occupied. She reached down and gripped the heavy Winchester. The cold metal didn't sting. It felt like an extension of her own steeled resolve. She worked the lever with a crisp, metallic clack-clack that echoed through the canyon like a gunshot. It was a sound of mastery, a sound she had learned while Silas watched her in the quiet winter evenings. "He isn't a dead man, Abner," Martha said, her voice grounded and resonant, a sound that made the wind seem small. "And I am not your property. I am the guardian of this house, and I am the one who settles the debts now." She leveled the rifle at Miller's chest. The bakery barrel was gone. In her place stood a woman of the frontier, a creature of grit and grace who had learned that worth wasn't something granted by a judge or a father. It was something you held in your hands and defended with your life. Miller froze, the realization of his error dawning on him like a cold sunrise. He looked into Martha's eyes and saw not a victim, but the very mountain itself, unyielding, ancient, and dangerous. The blizzard roared around them, a whiteout of chaos, but Martha's aim was steady. She was no longer the mistake. She was the protector, and the past was about to find out that the salt of the earth could be as sharp as any blade. The blizzard shrieked with a renewed predatory vigor, 1,000 rusted saws cutting through the gray light of the canyon. Martha stood in the churning mud, the indigo wool of her tunic snapping like a whip against her heavy frame. In her hands, the Winchester felt like a part of her own skeleton, cold, unyielding, and honest. Across the clearing, Abner Miller and his 2 hired shadows were silhouettes of desperation, their vanity stripped away by the salt-cured reality of the high country. They saw a woman they had once called a barrel, but the creature standing before them now was something ancient, a guardian born of grit and the silence of the peaks. "I said move." Martha's voice was a steel declaration, low and grounded, vibrating with a frequency that seemed to calm the very air around her. The internal echoes of Oakhaven, the titters of the social hall, the worn-thin apologies of her father, were gone, replaced by the rhythmic tectonic pulse of her own heart. She didn't blink as the sleet pelted her face. The ice crystals turning the gray mud on her cheeks into a mask of granite. Miller's face was a map of alkali pale terror and stubborn bitterness. He looked at the rifle, then at the man pinned beneath the cedar. "You won't pull that trigger, Martha," he rasped, his voice a jagged thing that struggled against the wind. "You're a baker's daughter. You're soft. You're made of yeast and sugar, not lead and iron. That giant has filled your head with mountain rot, but you're still the same heavy, useless girl your father couldn't wait to be rid of." The words were meant to be a blade, but they struck Martha like rain against a cliffside. She felt the weight of her body, the substantial geography that had once been her shame, and realized it was the very thing that anchored her to the earth. She wasn't soft, she was tempered. She was the salt of the earth, and the salt was meant to preserve, not to crumble. "I reckon you've spent too much time counting other people's debts, Abner," Martha said, her finger tightening on the trigger guard. "You've forgotten how to recognize a woman who's finally paid her own." One of the hired men, the one with the scarred nose, made a sudden desperate lunge for his fallen revolver. Martha didn't hesitate. She didn't scream. She pivoted with a slow, rhythmic grace, the barrel of the Winchester tracking his movement with the inevitability of a sunset. She squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was a thunderclap that shattered the mountain silence, a sharp metallic bark that sent a spray of mud and ice into the man's face. She hadn't aimed for his chest. She had aimed for the ground inches from his hand. Oh, a warning written in lead and fire. The man froze, his fingers inches from the steel, his eyes wide and hollowed out. The smell of burnt cordite, sharp, acrid, and final, mingled with the scent of the coming snow. "The next one won't find the mud," Martha said, her voice never wavering. "I have enough lead in this lever to bury all three of you before the frost sets in. Now, take your wounded pride and your hollowed-out papers and get off this mountain. The trail is failing, and the mountain has a long memory for those who don't belong." Miller looked at his men, then at the woman who had transformed from a mistake into a fortress. He saw the way she held the rifle, the way her feet were planted in the muck like the roots of the cedar. He knew then that the bakery barrel was a ghost. In its place was a guardian he could never own, a force of nature he could never ledger. Without a word, Miller turned, his fine broadcloth coat flapping like a broken wing, and began the ignominious retreat into the timber, his men following like beaten curs. Martha didn't lower the rifle until the shadows of the riders had been swallowed by the whiteout of the blizzard. Only then did the heroic shift move from the hunt to the rescue. She dropped the Winchester and turned toward the massive cedar trunk that sat across Silas's legs like a cold iron weight. "Silas," she breathed, her breath a white rhythmic plume in the freezing air. The giant was still, his face the color of wood ash. The mud was rising around him, a viscous gray tide that threatened to suffocate his spirit as much as his lungs. Martha knelt in the filth, the cold biting into her knees. But she didn't feel the sting. She felt only the fire of a singular, heroic purpose. She looked at the tree. It was an ancient thing, heavy with the weight of a century of winters. Any other woman, any small, bird-like woman, would have sat in the mud and waited for the end. But Martha was a woman of substance. She remembered the competence porn of the winter, the way she had learned to use leverage to move the heavy flour sacks, the way she had mastered the mechanical logic of the hearth. She scanned the debris of the slide until her eyes landed on a heavy, iron-shod pry bar Silas had used for the spring fences. It was half submerged in the alkali pale mud. She lunged for it, her fingers gripping the cold metal, and dragged it back to the cedar. She didn't just push, she engineered. She found a granite boulder that had been carried down by the slide, a solid, unyielding fulcrum. She jammed the pry bar under the curve of the cedar trunk, using the rock to create a point of power. "Silas, you have to help me," she commanded, her voice a steeled declaration. "I'm the foundation, remember? But I need you to find the strength twixt the pain." Silas's eyes flickered open, dark and unreadable, reflecting the bruised slate gray of the sky. He let out a low, guttural groan, his hands gripping the mud as he prepared to push. Martha threw her entire weight against the pry bar. She didn't just use her arms, she used the geography of her body, the very mass that the town had mocked. She leaned into the iron, her muscles screaming with a jagged, white-hot heat, her lungs burning with the thin, metallic air of the peaks. And the internal monologue of her life, the too much, the too heavy, became her fuel. She was the only thing in the world heavy enough to move this mountain. "Move!" she screamed, the sound tearing through the shriek of the blizzard. The cedar groaned, a slow, rhythmic protest of wood against iron. For a heartbeat, the world hung in a balance twixt life and the grave. Then, with a wet, visceral suck of the mud, the trunk shifted. It rose just inches, enough for a man of the salt of the earth to claw his way back from the brink. Silas lunged forward, his movements a desperate tectonic scramble. He cleared the trunk just as Martha's strength failed and the cedar slammed back into the muck with a sound that shook the earth. Martha collapsed into the mud beside him, her breathing a ragged, wet hitch. They lay there for a moment, the two giants broken and forged by the same hardscrabble land. The sleet covered them in a fine white shroud, but the heat of their shared survival was a fire that the mountain couldn't extinguish. Silas reached out, his massive, scarred hand finding hers in the filth. He didn't speak a stuttered thanks. He didn't have to. The way his fingers laced through hers, gripping with a strength that was both desperate and grounded, was a declaration of its own. He looked at her, not as a baker's daughter, not as a barrel, but as the woman who had stood before the rifles in the timber and said no. "Guardian," he whispered, the word a low rumble that vibrated in the very floorboards of the world. Martha looked at the cabin, its windows dark, but its walls still standing. She looked at the man beside her, a king of the mountain who had been saved by the very thing the world had discarded. The bitterness of the alkali was gone, replaced by the metallic, heroic taste of victory. She stood up, her legs shaking but her spirit steeled, and helped the giant to his feet. As they limped toward the door, the blizzard began to lose its teeth, the wind dying down into a low, rhythmic moan. The past was gone, driven back into the valley of shadows. The calamity had passed, and in its wake, it had left something more solid than granite, a woman who knew her worth and a home that was no longer a tomb. They stepped across the threshold, and as the heavy oak door closed behind them, the silence of the mountain was finally, absolutely their own. The descent from the high country was a slow, rhythmic unspooling of the mountain's silence, a journey that felt like a reverse birth. As Martha and Silas moved toward the lowlands, the air began to lose its sharp antiseptic bite of cedar and ancient snow, replaced by a heaviness that sat in the back of the throat like a coating of cold grease. The trail was a jagged ribbon of red mud and shale, a path that Martha walked with a steeled fluidity. Her body, once a source of constant internal apology, now occupied the geography of the trail with an absolute authority. She was no longer a woman trying to be small. She was a woman whose every footstep claimed the earth beneath her. Silas walked beside her, his presence a tectonic shadow, the rhythmic thud crunch of his boots making the very grit of the valley floor groan in protest. They didn't arrive in Oakhaven under the cover of night like thieves or outcasts. They arrived at high noon, the sun a pale, uncaring eye in a sky the color of a bruised plum. Oakhaven hadn't changed, yet to Martha's eyes it had shrunken. The buildings, the general store with its peeling gray paint, the saloon with its swinging doors that sounded like a rusted hinge on a grave, seemed huddled together in a desperate hardscrabble attempt to keep out the truth of the wilderness. The dust in the main street didn't just hang, it swirled in low rhythmic eddies, coating the storefronts in a fine alkali pale powder that tasted of bitterness and old settled debts. As their boots struck the timber of the boardwalk, the town's collective breath seemed to catch twixt its teeth. The sound of Martha's footsteps was a steeled declaration, and people emerged from the shadows, the same people who had once called her the bakery barrel, with a dry, rattling titter. They looked for the woman who had been a joke they could roll into a dark corner, but they found a creature of grit and grace. Martha's face was a map of granite and frost, her indigo wool tunic stained with the mud of the slide, her eyes holding the clarity of a mountain lake that had finally settled after a storm. The internal echoes of the social hall, the laughter that had once cut her like a rusted blade, now felt like distant, dying embers. She looked at the women in their worn thin silk, their faces etched with the acidity of their own small lives, and she felt a somber, heroic distance. They found Abner Miller in the center of the market square, standing beside the town's public ledger. While he was surrounded by a few of the salt-of-the-earth men who still owed him markers, his voice a jagged rasp as he complained about the theft of his property. He looked up, and the words died in his throat, replaced by a sudden metallic tang of fear. "You!" Miller hissed, his hand instinctively reaching for the ruined, mud-stained broadcloth of his coat. He looked at Silas, who stood like a silent sentinel of the wilderness, his scarred hands resting at his sides, his presence pulling the light from the square. Then Miller looked at Martha, and his lip curled in a rusted remnant of his former arrogance. "You've got a lot of nerve coming back here, girl. The law is still looking for that writ you ignored. You're a fugitive from a legal debt. And I reckon the judge won't be as merciful as the mountain." Martha didn't stop until she was 3 feet from him. The silence in the square didn't just hang. It pressed against the ribs of every man and woman present like a cold iron weight, suffocating the words before they could reach their lips. "The law," Martha said, her voice a grounded rumble that made the windows of the nearby assay office hum. "The law is a tool for men who are too hollowed out to stand on their own word. You didn't come for a debt, Abner. You came for a pound of flesh you thought was too soft to fight back. You came for the barrel because you thought it had no teeth." She reached into the folds of her tunic. The movement was slow and rhythmic, the fabric of her indigo wool whispering against her skin. She pulled out a heavy, salt-stained leather pouch, not the one Silas had dropped months ago, but a new one, filled with the weight of their shared winter labor and the silver Silas had mined from the mountain's ribs. She didn't drop it. She placed it on the public ledger with a slow, rhythmic finality. The sound of the leather hitting the wood, thud, was the sound of a verdict being delivered. "There is the remainder of the bakery's debt, plus the interest you've claimed in the Valley Court," she stated, her words short and hard as flint. "Paid in the silver Silas earned and the labor I gave to the mountain, my father's ledger is clear. The bakery is no longer a chain, and I am no longer a line in your book." Miller's eyes flickered with a desperate greed, his fingers twitching toward the gold, but he didn't reach for it. "It's not enough. There's the matter of the writ, the insult to my men, the damage to my horse and my standing." "The only damage here, Abner, is the rot in your own soul," Martha interrupted. She stepped closer, her substantial geography dwarfing his lean, bitter frame. The internal monologue of her life, the too much, the too heavy, became her armor. She looked at the crowd, her gaze moving from the women who had mocked her to the men who had laughed at her father's shame. "You all looked at me for 30 years and saw a mistake," she said, her voice rising until it seemed to fill the very sky, a steeled declaration of her existence. "You saw a body that was too heavy, a frame that took up too much space. You called me a barrel because it made you feel light. But while you were busy counting the flour I used, you forgot to check the quality of the grain. You forgot that the salt of the earth is what keeps the world from rotting." She reached out and took the writ of reclamation from Miller's trembling hand. The paper felt thin, worn thin and meaningless, twixt her calloused fingers. She looked at the judge's signature, a dark, jagged scar across the white surface. With a single rhythmic motion, she tore it in half, the sound of the parchment shredding echoing through the square, like the snapping of a rusted hinge. She tore it again and again, letting the white fragments fall into the red mud of Oakhaven Street like a mocking flurry of snow. "I am not your property," Martha declared, her voice never wavering. "I am not a debt to be settled by a gambler or a widower with a cold heart. I am a guardian of a home you will never see and a life you will never understand. Take your silver and buy yourself a new coat, Abner. Maybe it'll hide the fact that you're the smallest thing in this valley." The town was silent, a deep tectonic silence that felt like the earth settling after a massive slide. Her father stepped forward from the shadows of the bakery, his face a landscape of regret and a flickering, rusted hope. He reached out a hand, his fingers stained with the white ghost of the flower he had spent his life trading. "Martha," he whispered, his voice a broken, hollowed-out thing that barely carried on the wind. Martha looked at him. She saw the man who had let her be sold for a marker, and she saw the man who had taught her how to bake. The bitterness was there, a sharp, alkaline sting, but beneath it was the grace she had found in the high country. "The debt is paid, Father," she said, her voice softening but remaining as solid as granite. "The bakery is yours. You can keep the flour and the ovens, but the daughter you had is buried under the snow on the ridge. If you want to find me, you'll have to climb higher than the alkali dust of this town can reach. You'll have to find a woman who isn't afraid of the silence." She turned away then. She didn't look back at the stunned faces of the townspeople or the ruined man clutching his silver in the mud. She walked back to Silas, who had remained as unmoving as a mountain ridge throughout the showdown. He didn't speak, but as she reached him, he placed his massive scarred hand on her shoulder, the same grounding touch he had offered at the social hall. But now it was a touch of equals. They walked out of Oakhaven, their long, rhythmic shadows stretching across the red mud. Behind them, the town felt like a discarded husk, a place of small lives and worn, thin lies. As they began the long, slow climb back toward the clouds, the air began to thin once more, turning sharp and clean. Martha felt the weight of her body, but for the first time in her life, it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like the very salt of the earth, solid, vital, and finally, absolutely free. 10 years on the high peaks is not a measure of time, but a slow, rhythmic accumulation of seasons, the way the lichen creeps across a granite face or the way a cedar sapling thickens its bark against the alkali pale frost. On the ridge where the clouds once tore themselves to pieces, the silence was no longer a void. It was a symphony of a life hard-won and steeled against the world. Martha stood on the broad timber porch of the Hardscrabble Ranch, a structure that had grown from a single hollowed-out cabin into a fortress of weathered oak and fieldstone. The air was thin and sharp, tasting of high-altitude pine and the sweet grounding scent of wood smoke. The sun was rising over the eastern peaks, casting a golden light that turned the frost on the railings into a spray of diamonds. Her body, though still a substantial geography, moved with the quiet power of a mountain that had found its equilibrium. The bakery barrel was a ghost so distant it no longer haunted her reflections. In her place was a woman whose skin was tanned to the color of salt-cured leather, her hands calloused and honest, her eyes holding the deep, stilled wisdom of the peaks. She looked out over the valley. Below the house, the ranch thrived. It wasn't the easy, soft prosperity of the lowlands, but a prosperity of grit. There were cattle now, sturdy, long-haired beasts that could survive a blizzard without flinching, and a garden that Martha had coaxed from the rocky soil through years of relentless rhythmic labor. She had spent thousands of hours kneading the very earth, mixing it with the compost of their lives until the granite gave way to green. The fences were not rusted or sagging, they were iron strong, a map of Silas's devotion to the perimeter of their peace. The sound of a heavy door creaking on iron hinges broke the morning stillness. A young girl, barely 7 years old, stepped out onto the porch. She was built with the same steeled architecture as her mother, wide-shouldered and sturdy, her hair a thicket of auburn that caught the pale morning light. She didn't move with a stuttered uncertainty. She walked with the grounded confidence of a child who had never known the weight of a town's mockery. Behind her followed a boy, smaller but with the same dark, unreadable eyes as the man who had claimed the mountain. "Mama," the girl said, her voice a low, melodic echo of the steeled declarations Martha had made a decade ago. "The bread is ready for the salt. The ovens hit the heat." Martha looked at her daughter, Ruth. She felt a resonance in her marrow, a quiet triumph that settled the old ghosts. This child would never know the shadow rule as a weapon used against her. She would only know it as the language of the mountain. "Then we shall salt it," Martha replied, her voice grounded and full. They walked into the kitchen, a room that had become the beating heart of the mountain. It no longer smelled of wet fur and ancient neglect. It was a cathedral of competence porn. It smelled of cinnamon, dark molasses, and the rich, yeasty perfume of rising grain. The table, the same oak table Martha had scrubbed until her arms ached 10 years prior, was now worn smooth by a decade of shared meals and shared stories. It glowed with a dark, defiant luster, a monument to the day the silence had changed. Martha began the recipe. She didn't just bake. She performed a ritual of survival. She sifted the flour, the white dust dancing in the shafts of morning light like tiny golden ghosts. She added the spring water, cold and clean from the granite cleft, and the salt, the heavy, honest salt of the earth. The kneading was a rhythmic meditation. She pushed the heel of her hand into the dough, folding, turning, and pushing again. Her arms, thick and powerful, moved with a relentless tectonic force. She worked the dough until it was smooth and elastic, a living thing born of her own labor. As the loaves went into the oven, the aroma began to dominate the cabin, a warm, golden scent that fought against the lingering cold of the high peaks. It was the smell of a promise kept. Silas was there, sitting in the high-backed chair he had carved for himself from a single, fallen oak. The decade had added more silver to his beard and deeper lines to the landscape of his face, the scars on his neck looking like a map of a war he had finally won. He was no longer the selectively mute ghost of the peaks. He was a man who had learned that words, when spoken with intent, could be as solid as stone. He looked up as Martha entered, and for a fleeting, silent second, the air twixt them hummed with the memory of the blizzard and the slide. He didn't need to speak a stuttered greeting. The way his gaze anchored her, seeing the guardian and the foundation in every line of her face, was enough. He reached out and took a slice of the warm bread, the crust breaking with a rhythmic snap, crack, that echoed through the room like a bone of the earth shifting. "The trade is good this year," Silas said, his voice a low rumble that made the jars on the shelves hum. "The merchants from the valley are coming up the pass tomorrow. They're asking for the mountain loaf. They say the bread from the bakery in town tastes like alkali dust compared to what's grown and baked up here." Martha felt a faint, the dry smile touch her lips, a rare thing, but as honest as the rock. The town that had discarded her now climbed the heights to find the very sustenance she provided. They didn't come to mock the barrel, they came to petition the queen. But the prosperity hadn't made her soft. She still kneaded the dough until her shoulders burned with a white-hot heat. She still hauled the water from the spring when the pipes froze in the deep of January. The mastery of her life was no longer a trial, it was her legacy. Internal echoes of her father's voice occasionally drifted up from the valley, news that the old man had finally closed the bakery, his hands too shaky to hold the flour, his spirit too worn thin to fight the rising debts. Miller, too, had become a shadow, his wealth eroded by the very greed he had used to hollow out others. He was a man living in a house of tattered broadcloth and bitter memories. Martha didn't feel a jagged hatred for them anymore. She felt only a somber, heroic distance. They were the dust that blew off the ridge. She was the ridge itself. As the sun climbed higher, casting long, golden shadows across the ranch, Martha stepped back outside. She watched her children playing near the barn, their laughter a sharp, clean sound that cut through the mountain air. She looked at the scars on her own hands, the pale silver lines from lye, from the pry bar, and from the cold. They weren't blemishes. They were the map of her worth. The silence of the mountain was absolute, but it was no longer heavy. It was a silence that breathed with her, a rhythmic partner in a life that had been forged in grit and finished in grace. She realized then that the rock bottom she had once occupied wasn't a pit, it was a foundation. And from that foundation, she had built a world that the alkali pale lies of the valley could never touch. She stood tall, her heavy frame a solid anchor against the wind, and looked toward the highest peaks where the snow never melted. She was Martha. She was the guardian. She was the woman who had turned the bitterness of her life into a loaf of bread that could feed a soul. And as the wind whistled through the cedars, singing a tune of survival and steeled resolve, she knew that the legacy she left behind would be as unyielding and as beautiful as the granite itself. She had found the salt of the earth, and she had made it her own. The sun began its slow, rhythmic descent behind the jagged teeth of the western range, casting a long, bruised shadow across the Hardscrabble ranch. The gold of the afternoon was fading into the deep slate blue of a mountain evening, a transition that always felt like the earth taking a long, steeled breath. Martha sat on the porch steps, the timber rough and solid beneath her hands resting in the lap of her apron. These hands, once dusted only in the white ghosts of a valley bakery, were now a map of the frontier itself, etched with the salt of sweat, the dark stains of fertile earth, and the silver ridges of scars that had long since stopped stinging. Worth is a strange, flickering thing in the lowlands. In Oakhaven, it was a ledger entry, a number tallied twixt the cost of grain and the weight of a gambler's shame. It was a flickering candle held by men like Abner Miller, used to illuminate the flaws in others so they might ignore the hollowed-out rot in themselves. For 30 years, Martha had carried that version of worth like a cold iron weight against her ribs, believing that because she was too much for their small scales, she was nothing in the eyes of the world. But the mountain has a different way of measuring a soul. The granite peaks and the alkali pale blizzards do not care for the cut of a broadcloth coat or the grace of a stuttered apology. They care only for what is solid. They care for the grit that remains when the vanity has been stripped away by the frost. Martha looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window, not with the shrinking retreat of a bakery barrel, but with the grounded clarity of a woman who had become the foundation of her own life. She was a woman of substance, and she finally understood that her weight was not a burden to be discarded, but the very anchor that had allowed her to stand when the world tried to blow her away. Silence, she realized, was not the absence of sound. The silence she had shared with Silas for a decade was a full thing, a rhythmic conversation written in the kneading of dough, the mending of fences, and the shared heat of a winter hearth. It was the silence of two souls who had been worn thin by the cruelty of the civilized world, and had found, in the isolation of the heights, a geography where they finally fit, because it was a silence that didn't need to be filled with the bitter, hollowed-out chatter of the valley. It was the silence of the salt of the earth, quiet, vital, and enduring. She thought of the recipe of her existence. You take the bitterness of the past, sift out the rot of other people's opinions, and mix it with the hardscrabble labor of the present. You let it rise in the heat of your own steeled resolve, and you bake it until it is strong enough to feed those who come after you. Her children would never know the taste of shame. They would only know the taste of the mountain loaf, honest, heavy, and earned. The internal echoes of the town's mockery had finally faded into the wind, replaced by the tectonic pulse of the ranch. The cattle lowing in the distance, was the rhythmic thump-thump of Silas's axe as he prepared the wood for the coming frost, and the sharp, clean laughter of her children. This was the music of her vindication. She wasn't a mistake that had been rolled away to a mountain grave. She was the guardian of a legacy that would outlast the very names of the men who had tried to break her. As the first stars began to pierce the bruised twilight, appearing like crystalline sparks against the dark velvet of the sky, Martha felt a profound, heroic peace. The journey from the rock bottom of the Oakhaven social hall to this high, hardscrabble porch had been a war of 1,000 small, agonizing steps, but every step had tempered her, Every cold night had hardened the iron in her spirit. She was no longer a person who had a debt. She was a person who had become the gold itself. She stood up, her frame casting a long, solid shadow against the cabin wall. She looked toward the trail that led down into the darkness, toward the flickering, distant lights of the valley, where people still lived in the cages of their own judgment. She felt no malice for them, only a somber, grounded pity. They were still searching for worth in the coins and the ledgers, while she had found it in the grit and the grace of the silence. Martha turned and walked toward the door, her movements slow and rhythmic, the floorboards groaning a familiar, welcoming greeting. She was going inside to the warmth of the cinnamon and the cedar smoke, to the man who had seen the queen in the barrel, and to the life they had carved from the very ribs of the mountain. The past was a rusted hinge, and she had finally closed the door. The world will often tell you that you are too much or too little, that your worth is a debt you must pay to those who hold the scales. They will try to roll you into the shadows and call it mercy. But the frontier teaches us a different truth, that the very things the world mocks are often the anchors that will save you when the storm arrives. Martha found her power in the weight they ridiculed and her voice in the silence they feared. Would you have stayed in the comfortable shame of the valley, or would you have walked into the silence of the mountain to find the salt of your own soul?